Hi, dear diary. I'm here to share with you so that we have a record, so we have a place to remember, to look back on days when I might forget why I do what I do, why I share so much out of my personal life as I make my way along this journey out of trauma, coming out of the trauma trap. And the front edge, the leading edge of that journey, right where I'm making progress, the new places that are opening up, and the intentionality and the effort that it takes to make progress there. My story is a little bit tricky in the sense that it has a small entryway, but then it widens up. So let me explain. I share on the cutting edge of my trauma healing because God called me to. As I was noticing the effort that it was taking and the benefits that were coming, the joy and the conquering, the confidence that I was developing and the courage and all those things, I was reminded of a long ago, more than 25 years ago, message that I got. It was a little clip, an awareness of a program on television. 25 plus years ago. It was an interview that I remember. These are the details I remembered at the time, about a man who was dying, and from cancer, as far as I could remember. And he was being interviewed by a top level newspaper or on TV news journalist about the stages of cancer as he was moving along toward death. That's what he knew was coming. Now, it seemed to me in my 25 plus younger years that was really an odd thing. Like, why is he doing these interviews? He did 3 of them. And obviously, the person he was interviewing was gradually getting worse and worse, becoming more and more debilitated, sicker and sicker, closer and closer to death. And it was a man. And so as it progressed, the questions and then his answers were becoming deeper. It was not just a philosophical conversation. It was also about the loss of control of his body, the deterioration of his ability to take care of himself and what others had to do to care for his everyday needs. And I don't know, it just seemed a little bit like voyeurism to me. Like, what is it you're going to learn from somebody who's dying? What information that you're looking for, that you're delving into this poor guy's life when, his days are numbered? Wonder why. Well, then, as I began experiencing truly new life, fresh growth, deeper insights into what was going on inside me, and actually recovering my original design, the way God built me, the way Jesus put me together in my mother's womb. All of these things. And then having those things become apparent and leading me forward into my Ephesians 2:10 purpose, which is where I am now. Developing that. If if people were that interested in a man who was dying and what were his symptoms and how was he being cared for and how was that affecting his mind and his body and his spirit, here I was discovering new life in a broader and wider, a more vital flowing of Jesus into my life. Wouldn't people want to know about that? There's information about death. I'm ready to give you information about life. Now, there's no high level news reporter, television or print, that's asking me, but I know too many other women who have lost track of themselves, that pressures of this life have helped them to feel also caged, living small in a corner, not really understanding, even those of us who walk with Jesus, not really understanding what experiencing, maybe understanding in our minds, but experiencing fully, mind, body, spirit, what this abundant life is. That was me. I walked with Jesus for nearly 50 years and not a clue of this level of relationship and life, to be whole, to be secure, and to be free in a way that I didn't know all these years. So that's why I have been sharing, but that's my story. And there's actually, let me share the wider part. Let me share now, lead you into his story related to this. I've been functioning that way on that awareness level for the last 5 years. But just a few months ago, my hairstylist was helping clear out an attic, and there were boxes and boxes of books, and she was telling me about that. Well, my neighbor, who was housebound at the time, was a reader, and I thought maybe she could read some of those books. And so the stylist brought the box of books to me, and I went through them and cleaned out the box and all of that, and took them next door. But I held some of them back for myself, 3 or 4. And then the idea was that once my neighbor finished the one she had and I finished mine, then we would exchange. She had probably a dozen. She was reading them just fast. And time went by, but one of the books that I kept, Tuesdays with Maury, was sitting on my night table, and all of my library books were finished. They were all, I needed something to read to fall asleep. And this book was sitting on my night table, and I thought, okay, well, let me get into that little thing. Not very long. And I kept it because it says, Tuesdays with Maury, the runaway bestseller that changed millions of lives. Here I was experiencing new life. I wonder what this was about. And then it says, the subtitle is, An Old Man, a Young Man, and Life's Greatest Lesson. Oh, okay, good, that's good. Written by Mitch Albom. Oh, that'll be good to read. Hopefully, I'll get something out of it. But at least it'll help put me to sleep. And I began to read. These are interviews with a man who was dying. And it's written by, Mitch Albom is one of his students. Now, as I was reading along, I found out that the reason it's titled Tuesdays with Maury is because when Mitch was a student in Berkeley College out in California, he was going to write a dissertation, and Maury had talked him into it, was his advisor. And so they met every Tuesday to talk about this writing project. And Mitch was profoundly affected by that relationship and eventually became a very well-known sportscaster, writing, a sports journalist. And so when he realized his wonderful professor was dying of ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, he flew to Connecticut. He was living in Chicago, and he flew to Connecticut every week on Tuesdays to continue that fellowship time with his beloved professor. And so they talked about a lot of things that reminded me, they're in this book, that reminded me of those interviews that had been the motivation behind me really stepping up and being pretty authentic about vulnerable areas of my life. And so, those interviews of the poor guy dying of cancer. And there was some comparison here. I got about halfway through and I thought, now this is really interesting. There's something in here about being interviewed for television. I wonder, could this by any chance be the same guy? The one I remember was dying of cancer. That's what I remember. This guy's ALS is very different, and yet the interviews were covering a lot of the same things about his thoughts that were happening and how his body was being affected, and also his spiritual conclusions that were happening. And by the time I was 3/4 of the way through, I thought, I need to do some research and see who this guy is. And so I did. I went to Uncle Google, and I did my research. Sure enough, it's the same guy. Maurice Schwartz was a professor in Berkeley during the unrest, and I wanted to know the time frame. I thought, how long ago was this? It's just such a vague memory. This little concept of voyeurism about a guy who's dying. Can't you leave him alone to his private life? And it had been inspiring me these last years. And let me see, how long ago was this and where? I couldn't remember exactly where and when I had heard it. So that's what I discovered. It was the 1990s. And then the interviews that happened were done by Ted Koppel. If you don't know him, he was really at the top of his game. And a news journalist, he was on Nightline. He was the leading guy on Nightline, a big late night show. Not at all like Saturday Night Live. Anyway, Maurice Schwartz was a professor who was on Berkeley campus when the students took over the buildings, and he was part of that whole philosophy of, yes, you need to do whatever you need to do so that you can live an authentic life. And that was picked up by Mitch Albom, who wrote this book. And when he realized this beloved professor was dying and was going to Connecticut and doing these interviews, he decided that he was going to write a book. It took 2 years, so the book came out in 1997. But the interviews, and indeed the end of Maury's life, happened in 1995, more than 25 years ago. And it was ALS. It was the same. Now, I can't tell you how powerful that was, dear diary, and let's remember together, so it's recorded here, that the way it came into me was, think about it, Sandra. Think about it, that more than 25 years ago, God worked in your life, in your mind, to pick up on what was going on and how you concluded that it was, a little bit voyeuristic. And how would I feel if that was me? I don't think that I could handle that at all. But I don't remember where I was living. I could probably work it out. I don't remember what was, but it came into me. I don't remember sitting and watching all 3 interviews that were progressively worse. I mean, his condition was progressively worse. But that's the conclusion is what I remember. And here, all these years later, in other words, over all this time, that was sitting in me. God put it in there. He wove that incident, that impression, that conclusion, the mind, body, spirit, and it sat in my body. Maybe there was some trauma involved in it. I don't know. And brought it to mind as an inspiration for me to be doing the very thing he wanted me to do, to be sharing on the cutting edge of where Jesus is leading me into my new life. Not a story about preparing for death, but a story about his story about preparing for life in the midst of a fallen world. And in this time frame where it just feels like the world is really crumbling. And yet here I can be a spokesperson for the work of Jesus. Even if you've lived in trauma for more than 70 years, it's possible. I'm a living illustration of the work of Jesus, the new life that he brings in your mind and in your body and your spirit. And he showed me a pathway of this transformation, which is from Romans chapter 12, verse 2. Be transformed by the renewing of your mind, and his awareness of what's going on and the leading me in how to address that impact, to minimize it, to shift the negative to heal them really, the negative neural pathways and replace them, heal them, make them not as deep, not as tragic, not as severe, and replace them with fresh neural pathways of life and growth, of security, of freedom, of wholeness, based on a relationship with God, the Father, through the Son, with the Holy Spirit living in here and guiding, convicting, counseling, comforting. The abundant life that I know for me, it was in my mind. It's what I signed up for. But I've only been learning about it and growing in it and appreciating it and blooming in it for the last 5 years or so. So I receive that diary. Let's remember, I receive that as more than just, isn't that a clever thing of how Holy Spirit could do this and do that and then lead me into this new place? But the fact that that happened, the reality of this connection over all the years is evidence that I can't deny. And I want to share it with you, diary, so that you know too, and that we can remember. And then on with the videos and the courses and the groups and the book that will come about trauma and the gospel melded together. Trauma seen through the view, through the life of the gospel. And if God can do that in this one thing for me, to help me to recover my design and to live my purpose, think of all the other things he's been doing and intends to continue to do. You know, there's a verse that says that he continues this new life process even when you're old and you have gray hair. I give a testimony to that, by the way. And if he can do it for me, he can do it for you. I want every woman to know. So, dear diary, let's keep this record and let's share it with others. And on days when I'm pretty worn out and I'm just wondering, what's the point? Help me to pull this video up and remember this entry in this diary, that this is who God is. This is the abundant life that comes through a relationship through Christ unto the Father with the Spirit. That's probably enough for now, right? Okay, thanks, dear diary. We're not going to write the end. I'm going to just put a ... because I'll be back.